most of the species, perhaps all the species on Earth today, are heavily affected by humans and our actions. And as we try to deal with that, to make things better for the animals, better for the ecosystems, one of the things we need to be aware of and to put into our considerations is the culture of the animals out there. Sure, it's human culture that's causing all the problems, and it's human culture that will provide the solutions. But if we're going to get good solutions, we need to consider the culture of the animals. So I'm going to talk about a number of issues. First, going back to really what we're trying to do, the goals of conservation biology and the goals of animal welfare. And particularly in conservation biology, a theme that comes up time and time again is diversity. So what is biological diversity, and how does animal culture fit into that? So then we look at populations of animals which have a cultural component to their behavior. And what are the characteristics of these populations? What are the characteristics that relate to our attempts to conserve them and to consider their welfare? Well, one of the most important things is resilience. How resilient are populations and ecosystems to what we do to them? And animal culture has a big role there. It also has a big role in the way that animals exploit what we do to their world and to them. And this exploitation can have very negative consequences, both for us and for the animals. When things get really bad, we resort to strategies like translocation and reintroduction. And again, culture has a big role. Another area where culture's had actually quite a prominent role is in trying to figure out what we're trying to conserve, to delineating conservation units. And at a much smaller scale, it has implications for the animals that are completely in our control. The captive animals that we use for food, for entertainment, and so on. How should we treat them? Well, let's look at what conservation biologists see as the goals of their field. First, they try and describe the diversity of the living world. They try to understand the effects of human activities on species, on communities and ecosystems. And then they develop practical interdisciplinary approaches to protecting and restoring biological diversity. Animal welfare, it's a little bit simpler. The goals are to provide for an animal's physical and mental needs. Well, that does sound simple, but what are physical and mental needs, and how does culture fit into that? So these are the things we're going to be considering. And let's start off with the conservation side of things. Two words that come up on the left side of the screen are diversity. So conservation biologists are really interested in diversity, first in describing it, and then to protecting and restoring it. We can perhaps recognize a diverse ecosystem or a diverse species, but it's not obvious. And we should consider biological diversity, and conservation biologists do, both within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So for the first two of these, the general picture is to consider phenotypic diversity. And it's very frequently assumed that phenotypic diversity is the result of genetic processes. So genetic diversity is often thought to equate to phenotypic diversity, and genetic diversity being the goal of conservation biology, preserving it and protecting it. However, as has been made clear earlier in this course, the phenotype doesn't just depend on genes, it depends on other processes too, of which cultural processes can be extremely important. So the phenotypic diversity of a population depends not only on the genes it possesses and how varied they are, but on the cultural practices it possesses and how varied they are. So in this sense, conservation biologists should be interested in culture as one of the factors providing biological diversity. For ecosystems, it's not quite so clear immediately where culture fits in, but we do know that the variation in ecosystems can have a huge dependence on the culture of the animals that make up that ecosystem. And I'm just going to give an example, a quite well-known example. And this happens in the Aleutian Islands, off the Aleutian Islands, southern Alaska. And in these nearshore ecosystems, a key species, a keystone species, is the kelp. These huge algal organisms completely structure the environment there and provide vital habitat for all kinds of things. So if we look at the abundance of kelp, that's the green line in the diagram here, this one, and do it, say, between 1910 and 2010, it was very low for most of the early part of the 20th century. And then it rose dramatically in the 1960s, and stayed that way for about 10, 15 years before starting to fall again. So what was going on? Well, what was going on was the kelp were being affected by the abundance of another species, the sea urchins, shown in red here. These are the sea urchins. And when the sea urchins are common in the early part of the time period and in the later part of the time period, they eat the kelp and can graze it to barren grounds. But in the middle part of this time series, in the late 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was very little sea urchin abundance. And the kelp did great. Why was this? Well, this was because otters appeared. Otters appeared in the 1960s, the sea otter. And as the sea otter population grew, the sea otters ate the sea urchins, and there weren't sea urchins then to eat the kelp, so the kelp could grow. So when there's lots of sea urchins around, then you get the diverse ecosystem dominated by these huge kelp. Well, so what was going on here? Well, what was going on here is that there were cultural inputs at 3 points in this time series. Well, the first one is actually before we start, back in the 19th century, when we humans, because of a culture of liking sea otter fur to put round to clothe ourselves in, eradicated the otters, basically destroyed them. And there were no sea otters because we'd killed them all and made them all into fur. However, in the late 1960s, the otters, 1950s, 1960s, the otters start to come back. And the otters, sea otters, have a culture. They learn from their mothers what to eat, how to eat it, and so on. And one of the things these guys were learning was how to eat sea urchins. So in the 1960s and 1970s, these sea urchin eating otters started coming into the area. They started breeding. They became abundant. the sea urchin population crashed and the kelp grew. But then in the 1990s, another culture came into the picture. Well, at least that's what's hypothesized, that killer whales, who don't normally eat sea otters, suddenly decided, for reasons which aren't clear, that sea otters were a good thing to eat. And it might have only been just a few killer whales who decided this, because they are big animals, they need to eat a lot of sea otters. But killer whales came and ate up the sea otters. There were many fewer sea otters. The sea urchins exploded. They ate the kelp, and we got back to the barren grounds again. So here you can see how the culture of humans and the culture of other animals go to completely change the diversity of an ecosystem. Right. Let's look generally at the characteristics of cultural populations, of species where culture is an important determinant of behavior. And I'm going to look at some of the characteristics which relate to conservation and to animal welfare. The first one is that we can, as we've seen in some of the earlier lectures in this module, get rapid spread of novel behavior through social learning. But also, conversely, if a species has a conformist culture, there can be inhibition of the acceptance of novel behavior, and the species can end up in a cultural trap. This is what we do, and we're not going to do anything else because we must conform to the cultural norms of our population. A third factor, which we will see will become important, is that a species can be divided into subpopulations which have distinct cultures, and the subpopulations can become increasingly distinct and may even eventually become subspecies or species. And these subpopulations with the different cultures can be sympatric in the sense, in other words, they can be in the same area. So you can get what you might call a multicultural society with two or more cultures of the same species in the same area. Okay, now let's look at some of the conservation concerns that threatening the lives of real animals out in the wild, and how the culture of those animals may impact this. So first, habitat varies with space and time. So in different places and at different times, the habitat experienced by an animal can be quite different. But with human activities, these differences can become increasingly magnified. So the animals have to deal with this variation in space and time, and especially where we humans have been involved, they may have to deal with it in a very urgent way. So these are some of the things they can do to try and compensate for the habitat variation. First, they can eat something else. So if their current food disappears, well, maybe they can start eating something else. Secondly, they can change their foraging strategies. So maybe they're eating the same sort of food, but the food has changed in some way, where it is, how it shows itself. So a new foraging strategy may be the thing to do. And thirdly, they may go somewhere else where perhaps the foraging is better, or there's fewer threats. So these kinds of behaviors, changing food, changing foraging strategies, and moving, are the kinds of behavior that are affected by social learning and culture. So these changes can be promoted by innovation. An innovator can find a new food to eat, a new way of eating existing food, or move to somewhere else where things are better. But on the other side of this, these kinds of changes can be impeded by cultural conformism. So a species which is set in eating one food may not change, even if things are looking pretty dire. So culture can improve or worsen the ability to deal with anthropogenic changes. So let's give an example of both of these things: habitat variation, culture, and conservation. So a couple of ungulate species, bighorn sheep and moose, were very important to humans, still are, as targets for hunting, sometimes trophy hunting, sometimes substance hunting. And because of this, populations have been wiped out quite often. So the hunters got the better of the animals and there were none left. In consequence of this, managers would introduce populations of these species into areas where they'd been eradicated from some place where they were still extant. And initially what would happen is these newly reintroduced animals would not migrate in the way that the historical herds had. And they would not make the seasonal migrations between good places to be in the summer and good places to be in the winter. And they would suffer because of that, because there are the places to be in the summer and the places to be in the winter. The best places aren't the same. So an informed migration makes sense, but they did not have that. However, over periods of decades, the species became increasingly, these populations became increasingly migratory. The introduced animals learned about their environment and shared that information. So they were building up a culture of migration, which gives them more resilience in the face of whatever turns up, including increased threats from humans. So that's the good side of it. On the bad side of it, let's look at killer whales. And I'm going to look at a particular kind of killer whale, the southern residents, whom we'll meet later. The southern residents killer whales live off the west coast of North America, and about 71% of the food that they eat is Chinook salmon. They can eat other kinds of salmon, they can even eat other kinds of fish, but they really go for Chinook. Even though other species are more plentiful, and even though Chinook haven't been doing too well, and that again is largely because of us. We've done a lot of things which make Chinook salmon a species which itself is endangered. And so, for instance, as you can see from these two graphs, there's a very strong inverse relationship between killer whale mortality, the chance that a killer whale dies, and Chinook abundance. So when Chinook are abundant, the killer whales do very well, thank you. When Chinook are at very low levels, many of them suffer. And this is despite the fact that there are these other species of salmon around, which the killer whales could eat. So in this case, the conformist cultures, the killer whales, are impeding their ability to deal with habitat variation. Well, here's another example from the ocean, and these are the species that I study, the sperm whales. Female sperm whales live in kin-based social units, and each of these social units, with about 10 animals, is a member of a clan. And a clan of female sperm whales has a bunch of culturally transmitted behavior, which is characteristic of that clan and different from those of other clans, even though the clans may be sympatric, living in exactly the same area. So an example of this comes from research we did many years ago in the Galápagos Islands. So at that time in the Galápagos Islands, most of the units were of one of two clans, the regular clan and the +1 clan. And we wanted to measure their feeding success. Now this was tricky because sperm whales feed several hundred meters below the ocean on large squid, and there was no way we were going to see that. But they have to come up to the surface, and when they come up to the surface, they defecate. And on the basis of what came out must have gone in, we measured defecation rates. So a lot of brown patches behind the whale suggest they were feeding very well, and very few brown patches suggested times were tough. They weren't getting much to eat. So in 1989, which was what one might call a normal year for the Galapagos. Galapagos is on the equator, but it has a lot of upwelling, so it's a productive area. In that year, the units of the regular clan had almost universally higher defecation rates than the units of the +1 clan. And so we infer from this that the regular clan were getting more to eat per unit time, so their culturally transmitted foraging behavior was more efficient in the normal, the normal relatively cool year of 1989. Now, off the Galapagos, that's how it is most of the time, but every few years, things change. You get the El Nino phenomenon, the ocean warms up, and that's bad for pretty much everything in the ocean, including sperm whales. So 1987 was an El Nino year. The waters were several degrees warmer, and we saw very few brown patches behind the whales. The median number of brown patches behind the regular clan was 0 on a day. For the +1, it was a little bit more. Less than they normally do, but they were clearly doing considerably better than the regular clan. So we've got this interaction between culture and environment, so that as the ocean changes, the different clans do better or worse. And sperm whales are greatly affected by El Nino. Climate change is likely to increase the extremes of this El Nino cycle. So the cool years will be cooler, the hot years will be hotter. In this kind of situation, the cultural diversity of sperm whale clans is likely to become increasingly important. So diversity of culture like this will help the sperm whales deal with the variation in the environment that we are causing. Now, let's stay with resilience. And if we look across any species, humans, orangutans, we'll see variation, chimpanzees, we can see variation in how much culture each population seems to have. And there's several general rules. First, with low population size, cultures tend to be less rich. There are fewer cultural variants, less behavior perhaps determined by culture. And there will be fewer links in the social network. It's a small population, so each individual is likely to have fewer individuals with whom it associates and interacts. There will be fewer links among subpopulations as the population density goes down. And this tends, again, to make culture less rich, fewer connections. You also have less culture with fewer older animals. The older animals are often those who have the repository of cultural knowledge, which becomes important, and they are the ones who are models for the younger animals. So, with any of these characteristics, we tend to get a less rich culture. And with any of these characteristics happening, with any of these features happening, we tend to have lower population resilience. So when there's overexploitation, reduces populations, kills off the older animals in particular. When we get habitat destruction, we tend to get less rich cultures and lower population resilience. And this can be very important. And one particularly profound example of this, which isn't proven, but it looks like it's probably at least part of the story, is from the codfish. Now, the map on the left is of eastern Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador. In the waters of this area, there were codfish. There were millions and millions of codfish. The codfish were so numerous that they supported a huge sustainable fishery for hundreds of years. A large part of the people living in the area shown in this map made their living off fishing for the codfish, and in particular a subpopulation of the codfish called the northern cod, found off the northeast coast of Newfoundland and off Labrador. So the codfish and the fishermen subsisted in roughly, not, I wouldn't say in harmony, but they were both doing okay from perhaps the 16th, maybe before that, 16th century, maybe before that, until the 1980s. And in the late 1980s, the population began to crash. And in the early 1990s, it fell like a rocket. The population was being overexploited and it crashed to almost nothing. This was a complete disaster, obviously for the cod, but also for the people making a living off the cod in these parts of eastern Canada. The government acted too late, but they put a moratorium on cod so the very few left wouldn't be fished. The hope was this would be a short moratorium, so a female codfish can produce millions of eggs, so the potential is there for the species to come back really quickly. But this didn't happen. It's now nearly 30 years since the collapse of the northern cod. They've come back a little bit, but only a little bit. There's still very few left. These are still, by some measures, an endangered species. So what was going on here? Why did this species, which appears so resilient in its reproductive biology, not come back after being protected? Well, here's one of the things, perhaps one of the main things happening. There's good evidence that the young codfish follow the older codfish on migrations. And some of the migrations are shown by the arrows on the map on the left. With the near extirpation of the stock, there were almost no older fish. The fishermen, because they used nets and the nets were designed to catch the bigger fish, caught all the older fish. So at the lowest point in this curve, in about 1992, there was almost no older codfish left. And the supposition here is that without these older codfish, there was no knowledge of these migrations between feeding and spawning grounds. So the young fish didn't know where to go. They didn't go to the right places. They weren't able to feed properly and to spawn properly. And it takes many years in this kind of situation to rebuild the knowledge and the stock. Well, we certainly exploited the codfish, but there are species out there which have used the changes in the way humans have used the environment to exploit us. So, for instance, you can have vultures and baboons using the discards at our garbage dumps. You can have elephants raiding crops. And my sperm whales have a habit in some parts of the world of going down and very delicately taking fish off fishing gear and then eating them. Saves them having to dive hundreds of meters and provides them with a good meal, but isn't seen so favorably by the fishermen. A situation which seems good from both parts is dolphins being fed by tourists. The tourists think it's cool, the dolphins think it's cool, but perhaps not. And this one is certainly not good for the humans when tigers begin to eat us. In all of these situations, there are suggestions, sometimes quite good proof, sometimes just suggestions, that social learning has had a role. And these situations are bad in general for the animals. They lose their natural behavior. They lose perhaps their natural fear of humans, which is almost always adaptive. There can be social segregation. So, for instance, dolphins who accept the handouts from fishermen don't associate with those that don't. So you get a population being divided up by these activities. You can get disease. So, for instance, baboons catching diseases at garbage dumps. Now, fishermen and farmers and people who are scared about any of these activities start killing individuals. And they can make more systematic calls for culls, for organized efforts to go and eradicate or nearly eradicate these species because of the harm they cause. So these things are generally bad. And the problem as far as social learning and culture goes is that the speed of spread and the impact of these activities tend to be greatly exacerbated by social learning. If things get really bad and a population's gone, we need to think about translocation and reintroduction. So moving animals from other areas into a place where they've gone, translocation, or from captivity, reintroduction. And these are the things that were being done with the ungulates in the earlier example. And the purposes of this are obviously to establish species which are extinct or low numbers in the wild, to restore natural ecosystems. So, for instance, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park was partly about having wolves there, but partly about the role that the wolves play in that ecosystem. Thirdly, to provide hunting opportunities. People want to hunt these animals, so that was a big incentive for the ungulate translocations and reintroductions we mentioned earlier. And sometimes when they haven't got too low, or maybe they're extirpated somewhere, but there's a few somewhere else, having another more vibrant population can increase the survival prospects of the whole threatened species. So these are important tools and can have major benefits, but they have a very mixed history. Sometimes they've worked, the reintroduced animals have thrived, and a number of these goals have been achieved, but quite often they haven't. The animals have not survived, they've died, and sometimes they've gone on to try again. And obviously sometimes these are controversial. The reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone was a highly controversial action. So we need to do translocation and reintroduction as effectively as possible. And it's been shown in a number of areas for a number of species that incorporating social learning and culture into how we do these things is important. We saw earlier for the moose and bighorn sheep that they got it back themselves eventually. The idea of this seasonally migratory culture. But if one can put them into the new habitat with that information, then the prospects of achieving these goals is much higher. So here's an example of that, and this is the black-tailed prairie dog. And often a problem is that they have poorly formed predator avoidance strategies. So these animals reared in captivity, put in the wild, and they don't know what to do when something nasty comes along. So the managers of these systems try to train them to deal with snakes or foxes or whatever the dangerous animal is. But they found that if they trained them with an experienced animal, an animal who'd been in the wild, who knew how to deal with these animals, the naive ones were very much more successful, and their survival rate for 1 year in the wild goes up from about a quarter of them surviving to about half of them surviving. And of course, generally, these trained individuals are more wary than untrained, and so have better prospects when a predator turns up. The next issue I'd like to talk about is defining population units for management and conservation. This is one of the most difficult things that conservation biologists do. What they're trying to do is to make divisions of a species or of a bigger population that can be managed separately. So this one has certain management actions, this one has another. And by doing it this way, we perhaps increase overall diversity. So we think of evolutionarily significant units, sometimes called ESUs, and these are delineated to preserve adaptive variation in genes and phenotypes. And because the evolutionary divergence caused by isolation over time and space may be important, so we want that diversity caused by this evolutionary divergence. These are usually delineated using genes, but culture is also a significant force behind the evolution and distribution of phenotypes in some species, the ones we have been considering through this course. So there has been a proposal by Sadie Ryan that we introduce a parallel term, culturally significant units. So different segments of a population or a species that have significantly different cultures. Another possibility is to add culture to the definition of the evolutionarily significant unit, to the ESU. And I'll show where this has happened a little bit later. But to give an example of this, I'm going to go back to the killer whales. And these killer whales off the northwestern coast of the United States and Canada. Now, these are killer whales in the area around Vancouver Island, Puget Sound, and they move back and forth across the Canadian-US border. Killer whales are, as I mentioned, are structured into ecotypes, and the ecotypes are structured into communities. The ecotypes have very different behavior. The communities have fairly different behavior. And we think that these behavioral differences are largely culturally propagated and likely culturally determined in the first place. So in these waters, there are several ecotypes and communities. The first is the southern residents, the ones which have the greatest focus on conservation. And these are the ones that eat salmon, especially Chinook salmon. A bit further north, but overlapping, are the northern residents, also eating salmon, also eating Chinook salmon, but having a fairly substantial range of behavioral differences from the southern residents. Also using the same area, the more wide-ranging transients, which eat not fish at all, but marine mammals, seals, and dolphins and porpoises, and the offshores, who eat deep water sharks. So there are these four different communities and ecotypes using these waters. And what are the conservation management organizations going to do about this? And we have a replicate system here, because this was happening, was happening and is happening simultaneously in the United States and in Canada. So killer whale ESUs. In the United States, the regulatory authority is the National Marine Fisheries Service. And in 2002, they looked at this, decided they weren't going to divide up the population. They listed it as depleted, which means there's a little bit of a problem, but not too much, which is, if you're going to put all the killer whales together, maybe a reasonable conclusion. And they said at that time there was insufficient evidence to indicate whether cultural traits were inherited or learned, and thus whether they truly signify an evolutionarily important trait. Now, from what you've learned earlier in the course, there's some errors in logic here, but that was their decision, and it decreased the possibility of protection, especially for the southern residents, the most threatened of the four populations in the area. In contrast, at pretty much the same time, the Canadian Assessment Authority, which is called CSIWIC, was looking at exactly the same issue. And they listed the different ecotypes and the different communities as separate designatable units, which is the equivalent of ESU in Canada. So the southern residents were listed as endangered, and so because of this, got a lot of protection, a lot of legal backing to protective measures. And they justified this on the basis that the different ecotypes and communities were acoustically, genetically, and culturally distinct. So really two very different perspectives for the same population of animals on how culture plays into the delineation of a species for conservation. Well, after a bit, the US, this was their previous their previous decision in 2002. In 2005, they looked at it again and decided that the southern residents classified as a distinct population segment, DPS, which again is roughly the equivalent of an ESU, and they were endangered. And this was based on an evaluation of ecological setting, range, genetic differentiation, behavioral and cultural diversity. So they came finally to the same conclusions as the Canadians, and now the southern residents, whichever side of the border they're on, have a pretty good degree of protection. And that's due to the recognition that they have a distinct and important culture. Well, CSIWIC actually, in 2018, changed their definition to incorporate these ideas more specifically. So they took genetic out of the characteristics and added or in functional and stable cultural behavior, and a clear distinction in dialect as a possible reason to find a difference between designatable units. So this is an example of culture being explicitly incorporated into conservation policy. Another one, and with less management significance, but much more global significance, is that the UN Convention on Migratory Species in 2014 adopted a resolution on the conservation implications of culture in cetaceans, in whales and dolphins. And in recent years, they've been broadening that to look at the important implications of culture in a range of other species, in birds and chimpanzees and so on. Well, I'm going to end by saying a little bit about culture and animal welfare. So animal welfare is providing for an animal's physical and mental needs. And this is when we humans are directly doing this. So this is for captive animals. There are various ways this can be looked at, but one I like is the capabilities approach, pioneered by Martha Nussbaum. And there we look at the quality of an animal's life, his or her dignity and free movement, and affiliations with conspecifics. And this can be adapted quite easily to include culture. So we need to provide for the capabilities of the animal, the things that it does, and are therefore thought to be important to it. And we can think, therefore, that cultural animals need the opportunities for social learning and their results. How do we work out what are the needs, the physical and mental needs of an animal? We can think about its capabilities, but it's not super clear off the top of the head, off the top, what it does and doesn't need. Well, in the next slide, I'm going to introduce a very controversial approach, but I think indicates that we do need new approaches to how we do this kind of thing. And this is from the work of Sue Savage Rumpo, who raised bonobos and taught them language, a symbolic and in some ways vocal language, and therefore was able to communicate with them. And she feels she's good enough at communicating with them that she could ask them these questions. She could ask them, what is important for your welfare? And she would get meaningful answers. Now, I'm sure not everyone is totally confident about this, but it's a really interesting approach. And when she did this, she came up with, well, they came up with 12 things that were important for their welfare. And I'm just going to concentrate on number 8, transmitting their cultural knowledge to their offspring. So this indicates that, at least as she understood it, these bonobos felt their cultural knowledge was important, and they felt that transmitting it, propagating that cultural knowledge was important. And actually, if you ask humans, this would be one thing that most of them would think was important. That humans can transmit their cultural knowledge to our offspring. And in situations where we're prevented from doing that, such as some of the abuse of indigenous populations, where there was a major attempt to remove their cultural knowledge, it has been acknowledged that this has been a major failing of some societies. So, putting this together, when we think about the conservation of animals and animal welfare, we need to conserve animal culture for its own sake. It is part of biodiversity. But we also need to conserve animal culture for its role in population resilience. And we need to consider how animal culture may exacerbate human-wild-animal conflicts. It can help us when we're translocating or reintroducing animals. It can tell us, in some cases, how we should subdivide populations so our conservation efforts are more effective, and that culture may be important for captive animals, something that they should have. Now, a point that Alison Gregor and her colleagues have made is that we should also consider we should also go back to social learning, the basis of culture, and think how social learning and the biases that have been talked about in earlier lectures affect conservation effort. And that these biases, and such as a conformist bias, can have a huge impact on conservation effort and the impacts of conservation effort. And we should also be very clear that an understanding of animal culture helps us to understand animals. If we want to understand these animals, we need to understand their culture. And if we want to address their conservation and welfare, we need to understand them. So for all of these reasons, let's put animal culture into our consideration of conservation and animal welfare. Thank you very much.